you everybody for coming out on this drizzly Monday night. Before I begin my remarks, can I just quickly alert your attention to this notice that you may have looked at already. I'm in charge of this project at Westminster Abbey to install a memorial to Lewis in Poets' Corner on the 50th anniversary of his death, which will be the 22nd of next month. And you are all most welcome to come to that service if you happen to be in London or near London or want to come for any particular reason. You just need to register for a ticket online. The tickets are free, and the more the merrier. If you can't come in person and you're the sort of person who prays about things, please pray that this is going to be a successful occasion. And if you're neither able to be there in person nor able to pray, perhaps you'd give us some money. It's costing quite a lot, actually, £20,000 to install this memorial. And we're about 2/3 of the way there so far. But every donation is welcome, small, medium or large. It's going to be a most memorable occasion. I think the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, will be preaching. There'll be a specially commissioned anthem sung by the Abbey Choir, a setting of one of Lewis's poems about love. The stone itself will be unveiled. Lewis's stepson and his surviving friends and colleagues will be present. There will be no other occasion like this, because alas, all the people who knew Lewis are getting fewer and fewer every year. So I commend this also to the House for your interest. But I'm here to speak under this title, The Heavens Are Telling the Glory of God, C.S. Lewis, Narnia and the Planets. And what I want us to think about for the next, 58 minutes or so is the 7 Chronicles of Narnia. Perhaps Lewis's best known works. In fact, I'm sure The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is easily Lewis's best known work. If you stopped any person in the street here in Plymouth and put a microphone in front of their mouth and said, C.S. Lewis, I think The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is what would come back. Though occasionally, even on that subject, people can get a bit confused. I had the privilege of living for 3 years in Lewis's house in Oxford, acting as a kind of warden and curator, sleeping in Lewis's old bedroom and studying in his study. It was excellent. But occasionally I'd be rung up by journalists who were wanting to write articles about Lewis, and I remember one particular journalist saying, "Hello, is that Mr. Lewis?" He's been dead 40 years at that stage. And then the journalist went on to say, "Well, I'm writing this article about C.S. Lewis and his classic children's work, Alice in Wonderland." There you go. So people can be a bit confused about even these famous books, but they are incredibly well known. Some of the best-selling and most influential works of the second half of the 20th century. And they've been recently introduced to a whole new generation of readers by those recent feature films. Though the less said about those, the better. Can I just do a quick survey here, please, and ask how many of you here have read at least one of these books, or seen at least one of the movies? Thank you very much. That's nearly everybody. Who wasn't putting up there? Just one. One. You might want to leave now. This might be a bit boring for you, but I hope not. There's plenty that we're going to be talking about in addition to the Narnia Chronicles. But they're still selling incredibly well, 60 and more years after they were first released. The latest figures I've been told are that they're selling about 3 million copies annually worldwide in over 40 different languages. But why spend even an hour of your life considering children's books in a university setting? I mean, aren't they just for the children? Why bother to give them your adult attention? Well, first of all, I don't think these books are just for children. They are for adults as well. Lewis said that he was writing for children only in the sense that he excluded things he thought they would not like or understand, not in the sense that he was writing about things which were beneath adult attention. And secondly, even if they were only for children, they would still deserve serious academic consideration, because, as Plato said in the Republic many centuries ago, the beginning is the biggest part of any work, and therefore It's of supreme importance in that work, which is the construction of the human person, that children should hear good fables and not bad ones. You know that Jesuit maxim, give me a boy until he's 7 and I will show you the man. Think about old proverb, the hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world. If that's true about the hand that rocks the cradle, then what about the hand that writes the bedtime fairy tale that is read over the cradle? That too will have a significant part to play in the eventual rulership of the world, because it's in large part what we learn in our formative years, when our imaginative responses to the world are being laid down, that so much of our future personality is being established. So what we read in those early years is particularly important. Now the question is, are the Narnia Chronicles good fables or not? They're popular, yes, but are they any good? Lewis read aloud the first few chapters of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe to his great friend, J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien hated what he heard. He strongly detested the way Lewis assembled figures from various incompatible mythologies. English children, who seem to have stepped out of the pages of an E. Nesbit book, centaurs, fauns, dryads and naiads, out of Greek and Roman mythology, a white witch character, who seems to be based on the Snow Queen in Hans Andersen, Father Christmas, for goodness sake, what's he doing in this book? And Tolkien, this was an abomination. This was a hodgepodge, a mishmash, and he threw up his hands and said, effectively, I don't want any more to do with this. And so his own familiarity with the Narnia Chronicles was actually very limited. He soon gave up trying to read the books when they eventually became published. But because Tolkien is so famous, his response has become very well known, and lots of scholars and critics have sort of followed in Tolkien's wake and assessed the Narnia Chronicles in a very similar way, describing them as careless, hastily written, thrown together without much forethought or planning. And from a literary point of view, you'd have to say that yes, they do seem to be very variously assembled. But surely there's a level of significance, a level of patterning and design beneath the apparent hodgepodge on the surface, because Lewis was not the kind of person who would just throw things together any old how. He was a very rigorous and consistent writer and thinker. One of his friends said that what Lewis thought about everything was somehow secretly present in what he said about anything. Lewis's own poetry is fantastically complex. I mean, mind-bogglingly complex. You look at some of Lewis's poems, you think you've worked out the rhyme scheme and the meter, then you look more closely and there's a whole other dimension beneath the one you notice. Lewis himself once said that he was enamored of metrical and phonetic subtleties, and the poems which look as if they're in free verse are often in the most complicated meters of all. Lewis loved studying the writings of medieval and Renaissance writers like Dante, Chaucer, Spenser, Milton. Writers, he said, who love to present us with something which can't be taken in at a glance. Everything leads to everything else in these writers, Lewis says, but often by very intricate paths. Complexity, he says, is a mark of the medieval mind. And as a medieval scholar himself, we might expect Lewis to follow that example. And then as a Christian too, Lewis believed that the universe itself is a fantastically intricate work of divine artistry. Every single thing in creation, he argued, had been made both for its own peculiar sake and for interdependent purposes with every other thing. Even seemingly random things have been made for a purpose in the mind of God. We may not be able to work out what that is, but Lewis believes there is a design. Down to the curve of every wave and the flight of every insect, as he puts it in his book on prayer. So you put those things together, Lewis's complex poetry, his interest in complex medieval writers, his beliefs about complex divine artistry. You go back to the Narnia Chronicles, which look such a hodgepodge, and you think, can they really be a hodgepodge? Most Lewis scholars and critics say, no, that really can't be the case. I mean, if that is the case, then that would be entirely uncharacteristic of Lewis and would itself need explanation. But most scholars have gone looking for an additional level of significance beneath the superficial literary hodgepodge. And the place, obviously, to look is at the biblical parallels running through the series. Lewis himself once said that the whole Narnia series was about Christ. The whole Narnia series, he said, is about Christ. And the Christ character, Aslan, the Lion King, is indeed the only character who appears in all 7 books. And he's Christ-like, especially in these 3. He's the Redeemer in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. He's the Creator in The Magician's Nephew. He's the Judge in The Last Battle. And the biblical parallels in these 3 stories are all very obvious and clear. You can't miss them. But these are only 3 out of 7 books. What about the other 4? Aslan is still present in these, yes. He's still Christ-like in various ways, guiding people, teaching people. But there's no major element or episode of Christ's life or ministry that's being reimagined in these 4 books. You might expect Lewis to give us a Narnian chronicle all about the nativity of Aslan. You know, Aslan being born into Narnia as a lion cub, like Jesus is born into Bethlehem as a baby. But you don't get that. You don't get a Narnian Ascension account. You don't get a Narnian Pentecost. Why not, given what he's done in those other 3? Instead, what do you get in these 4 books? You have in Prince Caspian, Aslan entering the story amongst dancing trees before giving a great war cry. In the Dawn Treader, you have Aslan flying in a sunbeam towards Lucy on board the ship. In the Silver Chair, Aslan doesn't actually come down to Narnia at all. He's confined to his own high country above the clouds, which doesn't seem on the face of it to be a very Christian way of presenting your Christ character, if he's not going to be incarnated into the imagined world. And in The Horse and His Boy, Aslan's mistaken for 2 lions, or maybe 3 lions, and he does a great deal of dashing about in that story. You remember, he says there was only 1 lion, but he was swift of foot. So why would you make your Christ character swift of foot? I don't recall Jesus in the Gospels being a notable sprinter or having a special ministry to athletes. You know, why would you do that? It's an interesting question. So when we look at the Chronicles from this biblical point of view, we don't fare very much better than when we look at the Chronicles simply from the literary point of view. We still lack an overarching design, an explanation for why the books are as they are. And yet we still have this problem that Lewis, as we know, is so interested in complexity and intricacy. So lots of Lewis scholars and critics have gone looking for a third level of significance that might tie the books together a bit more satisfactorily. And all sorts of different theories have been suggested, like the 7 deadly sins, for instance. 2 different scholars, independently of each other, came up with 7 deadly sins as the governing thread, and the only problem with their theories was that these 2 scholars assigned different sins to different books. So that didn't get off the ground. Another scholar suggested maybe it's the 7 Catholic sacraments, overlooking the fact that Lewis wasn't a Catholic. As an Anglican, he would have believed in 2 sacraments, not 7. All sorts of different 7s have been suggested. The 7 virtues, the 7 books of Spencer's Fairy Queen, the 7 dwarfs, I don't know, I don't think that's really been suggested, but I myself once made a half-hearted attempt to link the Chronicles to different plays by Shakespeare. But I soon abandoned that idea because I realised that I wasn't getting anywhere. You know when you're twisting books to fit a grid of your own devising, and this wasn't really working. But it was when I wasn't looking for it that I I believe I stumbled across the real answer to this imaginative conundrum. It's quite the most exciting thing that has ever happened to me while reading a book, I can tell you. And it's over 10 years ago now since it happened. I wrote up my findings in this book, as David mentioned, Planet Narnia. The BBC then got interested and made that documentary, The Narnia Code, which he mentioned, and there's now this other book of the same title. Please excuse the Dan Brown associations. I hope that what I'm arguing in this book is a little bit more serious than the Da Vinci Code. But it's a very big claim that I'm making in these books. And you would be right to be quite sceptical about it. I would be very sceptical if someone came to me with this idea. But let me give you, before we come on to the substance of this argument itself, 5 quick background reasons as to why we should not only allow Lewis to do something like this, but really why we should expect him to do it. So 5 quick background reasons, and the first of these background reasons has to do with Lewis himself and his own personality. Lewis could be a very secretive man. George Sayer, who knew Lewis very well for 30 years and more, wrote a good biography of him called Jack, The Life and Times of C.S. Lewis. You know, don't you, that Lewis was always known as Jack. He didn't like to be called Clive, let alone Staples. So he was always known as Jack. And anyway, George Sayer says in this biography that Jack never ceased to be secretive. Jack never ceased to be secretive. And if we're looking for examples of his secretiveness, the most obvious example is the fact that when he got married in his late 50s, he kept his marriage secret for the best part of a year. Have you seen the film Shadowlands? Do you know about this aspect of Lewis's life? It was the most extraordinary thing that he did. He got married to this American woman, and nobody knew about it for the best part of a year. A man who can keep his marriage secret can keep anything secret, I would say. But indeed, that's not the only example of secretiveness that we can find in his life. His autobiography, Surprised by Joy, left out so many really key things that one of his friends jokingly said it should not have been called Surprised by Joy. It should have been called Suppressed by Jack. This is a secretive and guarded man who's quite capable of inventing and keeping a significant literary secret and not telling anyone about it. Okay, that's the first background point, the psychological background point, if you're anyone's making notes. Now, an epistemological background point. Epistemology is the science of knowing, the study of consciousness. And Lewis once said that an influence which can't evade our consciousness won't go very deep. An influence which can't evade our consciousness won't go very deep. Now, just very quickly, let us summarize for ourselves what Lewis meant by consciousness. He meant 2 things. He thought the conscious life existed in 2 modes, and he writes about these in an article called Meditation in a Toolshed, where he pictures himself standing in the darkness of a shed one day, and through a crack at the top of the door, he can see a beam of light slanting down through the darkness of the shed. You can see little particles of dust floating in the sunbeam. It lights up a patch of the floor. And this he uses as an image of one kind of consciousness, which he calls contemplation, looking at the beam. It's the sort of knowledge you have of something when you're uninvolved with it. You're holding it at arm's length, you're inspecting it from a neutral, objective position, you're not getting involved. But then he shifts his position so that the beam of light is no longer falling on the floor, but is now falling directly on his eyeballs, and instantly, he said, the whole picture changed. He no longer saw the tool shed. Indeed, he no longer saw the beam of light, because he now saw along the beam of light. And what he saw along it was something quite different. The crack at the top of the door, the leaves on the tree waving in the wind outside, and millions of miles away, the sun itself. And this, of course, is his image of the second kind of consciousness, which he calls enjoyment. Looking along the beam. sort of knowledge you have of something when you're committed to it, you're inhabiting it, you are allowing it to embrace you, you're immersed in it. It's a little bit like the distinction between savoir and connaître knowledge in French, or the etic and the emic in anthropological terms. And Lewis says in this essay that really we should try out every question that presents itself to us in both kinds of consciousness. We should be like the ancient Persians who debated everything twice, once when they were sober, and once when they were drunk. There are benefits to our knowledge of being drunk, that is to say, of being immersed in an experience, where you're not holding it coldly at arm's length, but you're bringing it close, you're taking it deep. So when Lewis says this, that an influence which can't evade our consciousness won't go very deep, what he means is an influence which can't evade our contemplative consciousness won't go very deep. If we allow it to sink into enjoyment consciousness, then it will go deep. But it needs to get beneath the radar of our external, inspecting sort of mindset. We need to step into an experience often to get the deepest kind of knowledge of it. But then when we do that, this is the key point, the beam of light becomes invisible to us. Because it's no longer the object of our vision, it's now the medium of our vision. Light is not so much something we see as something we see by, Lewis says. It's still there, but it's not drawing attention to itself. It's illuminating everything else. So that's the epistemological background point, a kind of hiddenness to one kind of knowing. Now, a theological background point. Lewis was interested in this verse from Colossians. For all things were created through Christ and for Christ, and in Christ all things hold together. Lewis was sufficiently interested in this verse to paraphrase it in one of his books. He paraphrases it as, Christ is the all-pervasive principle of cohesion whereby the universe holds together. The all-pervasive principle of cohesion whereby the universe holds together. Christ is the cosmic glue, if you like, in whom we all find our existence from moment to moment. But if that is true, then it puts us into something of a predicament, which Lewis writes about in his book Miracles, where he says this: the fact which is in one respect the most obvious and primary fact, that is to say, God, Christ, and through which alone you have access to all the other facts, may be precisely the one fact which is most easily forgotten. Forgotten not because it's so remote or abstruse, but because it's so near and so obvious. That is exactly how the supernatural has been forgotten. So in a sense, what Lewis is giving us here is a theological version of enjoyment consciousness. If Christ is holding all things in being, including us and our very knowledge of Christ, then in that sense we are looking along the beam of a Christ-drenched universe all the time, and we can't get out of it. We can't step outside that beam and look back at it. We can't step into a Christ-less universe from which to survey this Christ-drenched universe. We are like fish in water. We don't know that the water is wet. It's only if you're an amphibious creature, and you sometimes go onto land, that you have any concept of dry. But until you have a negative with which to contrast your positive experience of a thing, it's very difficult to bring it to contemplative consciousness. Otherwise you just enjoy it, don't you? So that's a theological background point, a kind of hiddenness to our knowledge of God in one respect. God's very omnipresence means that he can be overlooked. Like Chesterton once said, if you want to hide something, put it in the open. Put it where someone will walk past it every day of their lives and they'll never give it a second glance. Familiarity breeds contempt. But absence makes the heart grow fonder. But if this is true about God, we can never be absent from him in that sense. To be absent from him would be to cease to exist. So that's our third background point. Now fourthly, a literary critical background point. Lewis wrote an essay called The Kappa Element in Romance, and kappa is the initial letter of the Greek word krypton, meaning cryptic or hidden. So the title of this essay basically means the hidden element in story. That's what romance means here. The hidden element in story. Lewis wrote an essay with this title. It should alert us to the possibility that there's more possibly going on in the Narnia Chronicles than meets the eye. The only problem is that this essay was never published under this title during Lewis's life, and it only exists in note form. But he did write it up under another title, On Stories. And in On Stories he says this: to be stories at all, stories must be a series of events. But it must be understood that this series, the plot as we call it, is only really a net whereby to catch something else. The real theme may be, and perhaps usually is, something that has no sequence in it, something other than a process, and much more like a state or a quality. And the example Lewis gives in this essay is taken from The Last of the Mohicans, where he says that when the hero of that story is half sleeping by his bivouac fire in the woods, while a redskin with a tomahawk is silently creeping up on him from behind, what makes for the essence of the scene is not the fact that the hero is in danger, so much as the fact that he's in danger from a guy wielding a tomahawk. You could have, Fenimore Cooper, the author, could have put a pistol instead of a tomahawk in the hands of this approaching marauder, but he doesn't, because a tomahawk belongs in this world and a pistol doesn't. It's a world very carefully constructed out of a multitude of seemingly unimportant details. The snowshoes, the canoes, the wigwams, the feathered headdresses, the war paint, the Hiawatha names, the whiskered trousers, the high cheekbones, and, yes, the tomahawks, not the pistols. What Fenimore Cooper gives us access to, Lewis says, in his very politically incorrect 1940s terminology, is the atmosphere or quality of red skinnery. We breathe the red skin atmosphere. And a revolver or a pistol doesn't belong there. There are, however, books which have no such pervasive atmosphere or quality, and the example he gives is The Three Musketeers, which he says is a terribly exciting book. It's got a rollicking great plot, but where's the weather? The characters go from London to Paris, and there's no sense that Paris is any different from London. It's just a bucket load of plot. One darn thing after another, but no convincing, all-pervasive atmosphere that you can breathe and enjoy. There's that key word again, enjoy. Because, of course, what Lewis is talking about here is a literary equivalent to enjoyment consciousness. When you're reading a well-told story which has a pervasive atmosphere, you're not contemplatively conscious of it. You're not thinking about it, you are living it. Think of it in connection with films. You know, you go to the cinema and you're engaged in the movie, but then for some reason it begins to lose your attention and you sink back into your seat, fold your arms, and then miraculously the frame of the screen becomes visible to you again. While you had been immersed in the film, the frame had disappeared. You move, as it were, the other side of the screen, don't you, when you're engrossed in a movie. You move about in the world of the story with the characters. Of course, the frame is always there, but by the magic of good storytelling, it can sometimes be made to disappear. And in a sense, that's what Lewis is talking about with respect to this kappa element, the hidden element. It's hidden by virtue of the fact that it is everywhere. Fifthly, in our background points, transferred classicism. This is a term that Lewis uses when writing about a review of the Oxford Book of Christian Verse. And he's talking about how Christian poets, up until the time of the 17th century, would take their knowledge of classical pagan mythology and transfer it into their presentation of Christian themes. Writers as late as Milton were doing this, he argues. And paganism, up until Milton, was, as Lewis puts it, the religion of poetry, through which the author could express at any moment just so much or so little of his real Christian religion as his art required. And everyone is in the secret, Lewis adds. I mean, if you read much medieval and Renaissance literature, you might think that Western Europe was still believing in Zeus and Jupiter and Venus, the number of times they get referred to. Of course, that is long in the past, but writers are still referring to that old pantheon of characters in order to say things about Christianity. God often appears, Lewis says, in medieval literature, but as it were, incognito, behind a pagan veil, dressed up as Zeus or Jupiter or Venus. So those are our 5 background points. Lewis's own capacity for secretiveness, his belief in a kind of invisibility within one kind of conscious experience, looking along the beam. A theological equivalent of that, God's overlookability by virtue of his omnipresence. A literary equivalent of that in a well-told story which has a pervasive atmosphere or flavour, and then hiding God behind a pagan veil. So that brings us back to our main theme, the Narnia Chronicles, and how they hold together as a series if they do. How are we doing for time? Yeah, okay, I'll crack on. So, how do the Narnia Chronicles hold together if they do? And at this point it's worth reminding ourselves that although Narnia is easily Lewis's best-known work, it wasn't, as far as he was concerned, his major work. His major work was his academic work. He was a fellow and tutor at Oxford for 30 years, finished his career as professor at Cambridge, highly distinguished literary critic and historian. And this was the biggest book he ever wrote. English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. A really snappy title. I think you'll agree. Can I do a survey again? Ask how many people here have read this book? Yes? Excellent. Congratulations. Well, isn't that interesting? That's precisely the inverse of what I asked the first time. Everybody but one person had read the Narnia Chronicles. Nobody but one person has read this book. And yet this was the biggest book he ever wrote, and when he published it in 1954, he wrote to a friend and said, I finally finished this big academic work I've been engaged in the last 15 years. It was the top tune all that time, and all the other books I published during those years were just its little twiddly bits. Which means to say that works like the early Narnia books and the Screwtape Letters and the Great Divorce and Mere Christianity, the books for which Lewis is now much better known, were, as far as he was concerned, just the little twiddly bits on this massive intellectual undertaking. They were the little tings on the triangle, the little piccolo flourishes in the symphony. But this was the melody, this was the main tune. It was part of a multi-volume series called the Oxford History of English Literature, which Lewis abbreviated to Oh Hell. Rather regretted taking on this commission work. But it's a very good book, well worth reading actually. And if ever you do read it, you'll find that it opens with a long discussion of the new astronomy that came in the 16th century thanks to Nicholas Copernicus, who, as you all remember from your history of science lessons, slap bang in the middle of the 16th century revolutionized astronomy with his theory of the heliocentric cosmos, as opposed to the geocentric cosmos which everyone had believed up until that point. And Lewis was interested in the Copernican revolution because he wanted to see how it played out in the literature of the period. Because obviously the kind of cosmos you believe yourself to be living in will have a major impact upon the sorts of stories you tell about yourself and your place in the world. And the Copernican revolution has a claim, some people say, to being the most significant change there's ever been in the history of human thought. Because Copernicus, in a sense, relocated Earth. We had thought we were central. Copernicus shows us that we're actually at the edge. The sun is at the centre. We go around the sun. The sun does not go around us. So Copernicus is kind of a big deal. And Lewis wanted to remind his readers and his students at Oxford and Cambridge of how important this change in cosmologies was. If we forget the old cosmology, we will have difficulty understanding the literature of the pre-Copernican period, because it is everywhere presupposed in that literature. It's a theme that Lewis returns to in The Discarded Image, where his last academic book, where 3 times in this book he encourages the reader to take a walk under the sky at night and try to look up at the sky as if they were medieval people, believing that the Earth was static and central, and try to work out how different that would be from what we feel today when we look up into space. The word space didn't exist before Copernicus in that sense. It's a 17th century invention. You wouldn't have felt you were looking up into empty space before the time of Copernicus. You would have felt that you were looking up into the firmament or the heavens. A series of ranked heavens, a series of concentric spheres, crystalline, transparent spheres, each rotating around the static and central Earth. The first of these spheres was that of the Moon, then Venus, then Mercury, then Venus, then the Sun. The Sun, remember, would have been regarded as a planet in these days. The word planet means literally a wanderer. These are the wandering stars, not the fixed stars in their constellations. Above the Sun was the heaven of Mars, then Jupiter, finally in the 7th heaven Saturn. These were the planets that could be seen with the naked eye. This is before the invention of the telescope, before Uranus or Neptune had been discovered, let alone the ill-fated Pluto, recently relegated to the status of a dwarf planet after the, 70-year career he had as a first division planet. Which reminds us, Pluto's fate reminds us that planets come and planets go as new developments in astronomy come about. Our image of the cosmos is not fixed and unalterable. But before the time of Copernicus, it was regarded as very fixed and unalterable. Here's a slightly more detailed diagram of the cosmos as it was believed to be. This wasn't superstition, this was hard scientific fact, as far as they were concerned. But we have discarded it, hence the title of Lewis's book, The Discarded Image. But we need to be reminded of it if we want to understand old literature. We've not discarded it in every sense. I mean, the very names of the days of the week, of course, are derived from these 7 planets. But we didn't spend time on that. Let's look instead at, briefly, Dante's use of the 7 planets. Here's an illustration from Dante's Divine Comedy, perhaps the greatest poem of the Middle Ages, in which you see the 7 planetary characters illustrated in the order of the days of the week. Because, of course, the planets were not just celestial objects, they acquired personalities and sets of influences and attributes. And the sun became associated with gold and illumination, wisdom. The moon, in her silvery gown, her crescent, became associated with water and wetness and wanderings and lunacy. There's Mars with his helmet and his chainmail, associated with warfare. This is Mercury. You can tell that because of the wings on his heels. Mercury the messenger. Then we have Jupiter carrying his scepter. It looks just like a regular staff. It's meant to be a kingly scepter because Jupiter was connected with all things kingly and monarchical. Then we have Venus in her green gown. Venus associated with love, beauty, sexuality, fertility, creativity. Still today, we have traces of that in our language, don't we? To venerate someone is to lovingly respect them. And to contract a venereal disease is also to do something under Venus that you probably shouldn't be doing. And here is Saturn with his sickle. Saturn was associated with death and disaster, cutting people down in their prime. So Lewis loved Dante's use of this old scheme in the Paradiso of the Divine Comedy. He also admired Chaucer's use of planetary imagery. This is a page of notes I found in Lewis's complete Chaucer. This is Lewis's handwriting. And he's making notes about Chaucer's Knight's Tale from the Canterbury Tales. And he says that Chaucer uses the planetary characters very cleverly in that story. He doesn't just put them as actors into the drama, he weaves the influences of the relevant planets into the plot, so that the climax of the Knight's Tale happens on a Tuesday, Mardi, the day of Mars. How appropriate for a story about knights. So Lewis has this academic interest in this old scheme. He also responds to it more personally and imaginatively. At the personal level, he was quite a keen amateur astronomer. He had a telescope on the balcony of his bedroom. He liked going to the local observatory. He also liked, particularly, amongst the Psalms, Psalm 19. The heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament proclaims his handiwork. Lewis describes Psalm 19 as the greatest poem in the Psalter and one of the finest lyrics in the world. So he has a personal and devotional interest in the heavens. He also has an imaginative interest. He wrote a trilogy of interplanetary novels during the Second World War. This is the first, Out of the Silent Planet, set on Mars, very medieval Mars. The second book is set on Venus, and in the third book, the planetary characters actually come down to Earth to bring about the end of the story. Lewis uses the imagery very explicitly in these three books. You can't miss it. But why did he attach so much importance to these planets? He said this: the characters of the planets seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols, which is especially worthwhile in our own generation. Of Saturn, we know more than enough, but who does not need to be reminded of Jove, Jupiter? So these are those small claims from Lewis. He's saying that it's not just a medieval curiosity. No, these are spiritual symbols of permanent value. And indeed they have a continuing life into the modern imagination where they are especially worthwhile. Why does he say that? Well, it's because of what he says in the final sentence. Of Saturn we know more than enough. Saturn with his sickle cutting people down. Lewis's generation was the generation that went through the Great War. Lewis himself was a teenage officer in the First World War. He arrived in the French trenches on his 19th birthday and saw active service for about 6 months until he was blown up in the spring of 1918. And the man in his trench next to him was obliterated. Lewis himself was spattered full of shrapnel, bits of which he carried around in his body for the rest of his life. He had seen sitting and standing corpses. He had seen the flower of his generation mown down in the Flanders fields. That's what he means when he says of Saturn we know more than enough. And indeed, he uses the term elsewhere to describe the general culture and feel of the 1920s as Saturnocentric, fixated upon themes of death and loss and cynicism and pessimism, despair, meaninglessness in the wake of the great trauma of the Great War. That was perfectly understandable, given what everyone had been through. But Lewis thought it wasn't an eternal truth about the nature of the universe, and a much better way of symbolizing the heart of spiritual reality was to be found in the symbolism of Jove, Jupiter, the king. Not the man with the sickle, but the man with the kingly scepter. So, when Lewis came to write the Narnia books, I believe, he used this spiritual symbolism again, as he had used it in the Cosmic Trilogy, but this time he uses it implicitly, not explicitly. Like Chaucer had done by weaving the influences of the characters into the plot, so Lewis does the same. He takes these symbols and he turns them into stories. but in a way that escapes our contemplative consciousness. He doesn't ask us to look at the planets. He just, as it were, throws us in to a Jupiter-themed world, a Mars-themed world, and so on across all 7. We don't have time to look at all 7, but let's just spend a few moments on the first 3. Jupiter is our first point of consideration. Here is the planet Jupiter. And in the southeast corner there, you can just make out Jupiter's great red eye, the great red spot, which is a storm perpetually raging on the surface of Jupiter. And the diameter of that eye, that spot, is greater than the diameter of Earth. You can fit the whole of our planet inside that circle. Shows you how massive Jupiter is, and here's Jupiter, the king of the gods. Now, I was reading a long poem that Lewis wrote about the planets. This happened 10 years ago. I was lying in my room in Cambridge, half asleep almost, about 11:30 at night. I'm reading this poem about the planets that Lewis wrote, and when I get to the lines about Jupiter, I read that one of the things associated with Jupiter's symbolism was this: winter past and guilt forgiven. That's one of the effects of Jove, one of the jovial effects. Winter past and guilt forgiven. And I do a double take. I think that's like a 5-word summary of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Because the White Witch in that story has made it always winter, but never Christmas. And her kingdom of ice and snow passes as Aslan comes in. When he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death, we are told. So winter passes. And guilt is forgiven. Yes, Edmund, the treacherous Edmund, who betrays his brother and his sister, his guilt is forgiven. So I look more closely at these lines about Jupiter in Lewis's poem, and a great deal of the imagery in the poem seems to link up with imagery from The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Principally kingliness. Jupiter is above all things the king, Lewis says in the discarded image. And think how Aslan is introduced in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. The children don't know who he is in that first book. They think he might be just a regular man, but they're told he's the king. That's the very first description given. He's not safe, but he's good. He is the king of the beasts, the king of the wood. Repeatedly, his kingship is emphasized. We're later told that he's royal. He's got a royal pavilion, a royal standard. And he ends up crowning the children too, so that they become kings and queens as well. He says to them, once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. Once a queen in Narnia, always a queen in Narnia. Kingship strongly present as a theme in the story. Indeed, the plot is really motivated by a clash of kingship between Peter and Edmund. Edmund has been ensnared by the White Witch. And we always tend to remember the Turkish delight. But what really captures Edmund is the prospect of becoming a king. The Turkish delight is just the bait on the hook. But what reels him in is the prospect of becoming a king so that he can pay Peter back for being so horrible. Peter, on the other hand, is taken by Aslan and he's shown the castle of Cair Paravel and the 4 thrones, and he's told that he, Peter, will be high king over all the rest. And indeed, Peter does become high king over all the rest of the children, including Edmund. Edmund does indeed become a king at the end of the story, but only after Aslan has demonstrated true kingship in his sacrifice for Edmund's sake. So that sacrifice of Aslan on the stone table, what's that got to do with Jupiter, I ask myself? I mean, isn't that just a convenient allegory for Jesus' death on the cross? Well, the same year that Lewis began writing The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe in earnest, he published another book, a book about the poetry of his great friend Charles Williams. And in this book, Lewis says, when Charles Williams writes of Jupiter's red-pierced planet, Williams assumes that the huge reddish spot which astronomers observe on the surface of Jupiter is a wound, and the redness is that of blood. Jupiter, the planet of kingship, thus wounded, becomes another archetype of the divine king wounded on Calvary. So this shows us that Lewis very explicitly connects jovial symbolism with the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, which of course is at the heart of this first Narnia story. Here's a medieval woodcut showing you Jupiter enthroned in the heavens. And down on earth are the people who exhibit jovial influences. So here on the right, we do indeed have a coronation scene. In the middle ground on the left, we have a man kneeling for judgment. Is his guilt going to be forgiven or not? And in the background, you might just be able to make out horses and hounds hunting a white stag, the white hart, the noblest quarry that kings and queens would hunt for in medieval romances. And all these elements Lewis puts into The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. You remember the last chapter of that book is entitled The Hunting of the White Stag. Now, is it possible that all those Jupiter-ish elements could have found their way into the first Narnia book by accident? I don't think so. What Lewis is doing is he's using this spiritual symbolism for two main reasons. To control the way he portrays the Christ character, as he is the true king, but also the way in which everything else in the story relates to Aslan. Aslan's Jupiter-ish influence is spread abroad across the rest of the tale in every little detail, down to the otherwise very puzzling appearance of Father Christmas. Why is Father Christmas in this book? Lots of people have objected to it. It doesn't seem to make sense. The Narnians show no understanding of a character called Christ, so what would they mean by Christmas? Seems like an elementary blunder on Lewis's part, and some of his friends urged him to leave out Father Christmas. But he was determined to leave him in. And I believe it's to do with this jovial theme, because in his university lectures, when talking about medieval understandings of Jupiter, Lewis would say, this is roughly how he spoke. Those born under Jupiter are apt to be loud-voiced and red-faced and jolly. It's obvious under which planet I was born. Because he himself was loud-voiced and red-faced and jolly, the bringer of jolly. Think of Father Christmas, loud-voiced, red-faced, jolly. The archetypal jovial character in our popular mythology. The only trace left, you might say, of Jupiter in this otherwise Saturnocentric 20th century, as it was for Lewis then. That's why Lewis puts Father Christmas into the book, because he helps crystallise that aspect of the Jupiter theme. He's interested in symbolic logic, not strict logic. It's the imaginative effect of all these elements that Lewis is concerned with, so that the whole story develops a kappa element, a consistent tone or flavour or quality. More quickly now, Prince Caspian, I believe, is the Mars book. Mars is the god of war, and Prince Caspian is a war story. It's the civil war of Narnia, the great war of deliverance, as it's called in a later book. Military events are everywhere in this story. Yes, you might say, but aren't there battles in almost all the Narnia books? What makes this specifically martial? Well, it's partly the fact that the word martial itself appears a couple of times. It's also the very centrality of the military events. But what clinches it is the other major theme of imagery running through the book, which has to do with trees and forests. You see them here on the cover of the book. Lucy tries to wake the trees. The Telmarines are frightened of the forests. The woods come to the final battle. Aslan enters the story amongst dancing trees. So it's not just the warfare that they went to town on so much in the recent film version that makes this the martial story. It is also the woodland imagery. Here's a mural from Pompeii showing you Mars in his twin capacities As god of war, yes, with his shield, his spear, and his helmet, but he's standing against a backdrop of burgeoning vegetation. He was known originally as Mars Silvanus. And we still actually loosely allude to this in our name for the third month of the year, March. March is sacred to Mars, because it's in March that the trees come back to life after winter, and also the month when armies can go marching off to battle. So in Prince Caspian, Lewis weaves the whole story out of these two main martial elements, the military elements and the woodland elements. And here you see them in one single picture. The single combat in the foreground, and in the background, the Sylvans. Sylvans in no other Narnia book than this one, and the Dryads and the Hamadryad. Aslan is the true Mars in this book. He gives the great war cry, summoning everyone to the final battle, but he's also the one in whose presence the trees come alive. The boys become knightly in the course of this story. The girls romp in the bacchanalian revelry with the swaying trees and the growing vines. Everything is infused with a martial atmosphere, down to the tiniest little detail of the chess piece discovered in the ruins of the castle at the start of the book. Could have been an unidentified chess piece, could have been a chess king, a chess pawn. Of course, it's a chess knight. It has to be a knight, with a little red ruby eye, because knighthood, chivalry, gallantry are part of the underlying or overarching or irradiating theme of the whole story. The Dawn Treader, you could almost guess from the title alone, because this is a story about a journey towards the place of the dawn, the rising sun. In this book, Aslan comes flying out of a sunbeam towards Lucy. When they encounter him at the eastern edge of the world, he's scattering light from his mane. The characters come to a magic island with a pool that turns things to gold. The sun's chief influence was a metallurgical operation, turning base metal to gold. Light imagery, gold imagery are everywhere in this story, but what, again, clinches it is that other theme, which is not so obviously solar, but has to do with dragons. You see the dragon ship. You remember how Eustace is turned into a dragon. They meet the sea serpent. Why all these dragons? I had no knowledge of this until I began my researches, but in Greek mythology, the equivalent of the sun god, the god of light, was Apollo. And Apollo, if you know your Homer, was famously a slayer of dragons. Here's a statue of Apollo in that capacity. He's looking at that miniature dragon, that lizard, and he's killing it with beams from his eyes. So, back to the Dawn Treader. Here's an image from the recent Dawn Treader movie. This is Eustace's eyeball when he's been turned into a dragon. And in the reflection of his eyeball, you can see the approach of Aslan. Aslan is going to come and rip off the dragon hide and turn Eustace back into a boy again. Aslan is the true Apollo. He is the true god of light in every respect, not just shedding illumination and helping things turn to gold, but killing dragons to boot. These stories are not a hodgepodge. They are minutely and sophisticatedly imagined. Just to list the remaining four, the silver chair. Again, you could guess from the title, because silver is obviously the metal of the moon. Here is the moon driving her chariot across the heavens. The Horse and His Boy is the Mercury book. Mercury, the swift-footed messenger, a god associated with theft and language and twins and numerous other things. The Magician's Nephew is the Venus story. Venus, the fertile creative planet, associated with motherliness and western gardens and magic apples with life-giving properties. And the last battle, of course, is the Saturn book, in which all the characters who are alive at the start of the tale are dead by the end of it. And who is it that brings Narnia to an end but Father Time with his scythe? as Lewis says in the discarded image, Father Time with his scythe and his hourglass is based on earlier pictures of Saturn. They are the same character, mythologically speaking. And in fact, in an early draft of the Narnia Chronicles, Lewis had actually called this Father Time character not Father Time, but the god Saturn. It's there in the typescript. But by the time Lewis came to publish the books, he obviously decided that was making it too obvious. And he changes it to Father Time, banking on us not knowing that Father Time is Saturn. So, if this theory is correct, why would Lewis do it? Two reasons, mainly. One, a literary reason, a kappa element in romance, giving each story a pervasive flavour or qualitative tone, which we enjoy as we read. And theologically, it helps him to present an orthodox biblical picture of Christ, not just the singular historical figure of the incarnate Son of God, moving about the stage of the world doing things to people, but also the cosmic Christ, the one in whom all things hold together. Because Aslan is the true Jupiter, in each case, who's present both in two modes at once, focused in his own person, but spread abroad in the whole of the rest of the story, but so largely that we can miss it, like the large words which escape us on maps, Lewis says. So the Narnia Chronicles are, on the face of it, a hodgepodge, a mishmash, and to that extent they are like a symbol of the real universe, which we too so often feel to be without apparent design or coherence. When we see all sorts of appalling accidents happen and the innocent suffer, we think, how can there be a divine author behind all this material, this haphazard material? But Lewis, as a Christian, believed that there was a design to it. Just as in the Narnia Chronicles, there is a design beneath the apparent mishmash, down to the curve of every wave and the flight of every insect. And on that note, I will stop. Thank you very much.
I think the warmth